Hello and welcome. This is Jason Rickman with the Canadian Automatic Sprinkler Association. I'm the National Codes and Standards Manager. In today's presentation, I would like to talk to you about Ontario fire protection and vulnerable occupancies. But before I begin, I'd like to remind everyone, as of January 1st, 2019, fire sprinkler systems are now mandatory in certain retirement homes and care occupancies as per Article 9751 of the Ontario Fire Code. The topics of discussion today will be as follows. I will discuss a brief fire history of vulnerable occupancies, fire sprinklers statistically speaking, Ontario Fire Code Part 9 Regulation 150/13, specifics about retirement homes and care occupancies, and fire sprinkler system requirements as it pertains to the Ontario Fire Code, NFPA 13, NFPA 13R, and NFPA 13D. This brings us to our history of fire and vulnerable occupancies. There has been a lot of lives lost due to the fact of fire and vulnerable occupancies. This is the reason why providing a fire-safe environment for our vulnerable is necessary to prevent death and injury from fire. In my perspective, one death is too much. And part of the solution is providing fire sprinklers. Here are just some of the examples of the reasoning behind why fire sprinklers is now mandatory in vulnerable occupancies in Ontario. 1969, Notre Dame du Lac, Quebec, 54 were killed. 1976, Gould's, Newfoundland, 22 were killed. Then in Mississauga in 1980 and 1995, 29 were killed. 2009, Aurelia, Ontario, 4 was killed. 2011, Timmins, Ontario, 1 was killed. And then in 2012, there was a string of fires that occurred. Edmonton, Alberta, 1 was killed. Langley, BC, 1 was killed. In Hawkesbury, Ontario, 2 was killed. And in L'Île Verte, Quebec, 32 were killed. Well, with this fire, the building was separated basically by a firewall. One side was the existing side, and the other side was the addition side. Well, with the addition side, they added fire sprinklers. In the existing side, unfortunately, there was no sprinklers. They did not retrofit that side of the building. Unfortunately, the fire that happened in this instance, in this building, happened on the existing side with the part with no sprinklers. And 32 people were killed. On the side of the new addition with fire sprinklers in the firewall, there is no deaths. Again, this is the importance of fire sprinklers in vulnerable occupancies and why it's part of the solution of the problem. I'll also like to mention as well, in regards to history, is with the differences between home furnishings from a legacy type of home versus a modern home. The fire characteristics are drastically different. As with a legacy home, the furnishings within these types of homes ultimately had more of a natural fiber, natural wood products, very limited amounts of plastics and polymers and synthetics. But when you look at the modern home furnishings, it's a little different. The building materials and building contents have drastically changed. Increased use of recycled materials, environmentally friendly materials, and more affordable goods is more available. Increased use of synthetics within the materials used. Polymers, plastics, also even lithium-ion power banks, power supplies is supplied within these homes. And also petroleum-based materials, increasing the fuel load, and also the fire behavior materials much different. Also to the open floor concept as well can contribute in this rapid, different fire characteristic, different from your legacy home. So what I'd like to do right now is to get you to look at an experiment that was done by UL, the Underwriters Laboratories. And what it is a comparison of room furnishings between legacy room versus a modern room. Both rooms were ignited by placing the lit stick candle on the right side of the sofa. The fires were allowed to grow until flashover. And we will see the flashover right now as far as when it occurs. So we'll find out when the flashover occurs with the modern room versus the legacy room. As you can see, there's a little fire in the corner of the sofa in the legacy room. And you can see smoke in the modern room in the background behind the sofa. So you can see the legacy room, the fire is it's being pretty much staying in one spot and not spreading as quickly as what you can see with the modern room, where the size is drastically increasing by the second in the modern room versus the legacy room. So we're 1 minute 30 seconds into the fire. So you can see the modern room has drastically increased in size with the legacy room, where the fire is still on the corner of that sofa, spreading very slowly. So you can see just by looking at these two rooms, the legacy room and modern room, the fire characteristics just by looking at the 2-minute mark is drastically different. As you can see, the modern room, the fire is continuing. It's now on the window shades. And ultimately, as you can see as well, there's more of the black type of smoke where high levels of toxic gases is in this smoke. And ultimately, this room is getting hotter and hotter and hotter by the second. And as you can see as well, the layer of smoke is increasing drastically, giving you less and less room to avoid the smoke. Legacy room, again, spread a little bit. It's now going more towards the middle of the sofa, but still, it's still located in an area with very small fire growth. Now the modern room, as you can see, drastically has changed at the 3-minute mark. We are getting very close to flashover, which flashover is basically everything within that room is ignited and ultimately on fire. You do not, I repeat, you do not have a way to live through this particular situation at flashover. You are in serious danger. So you can see ultimately the modern room has basically passed flashover. It's at flashover right now. Everything in that room is now on fire. Now when you look in the legacy room, the fire has spread at the 4-minute mark here, it looks like. Ultimately the fire has reached the curtains and now going up into the ceiling section of the room. But ultimately, you still have the time to get out in this situation. And with vulnerable occupancies, that is one of the biggest issues and the biggest problem is time. You don't have the time that you had with a legacy room versus a modern room. So the time of flashover for the modern room is 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Ultimately, that is definitely not enough room for our vulnerable to get out and get out of a fire situation into a safe environment. So we're about 28 minutes and 37 seconds into the legacy room. So you can see pretty much everything, it's getting closer and closer to flashover. The biggest thing here, though, is you had the time in these legacy rooms, which now you no longer have with our modern rooms. So we're getting close to 30 minutes. And ultimately, it looks like the legacy room is at flashover at this point. So 29 minutes, 25 seconds, time of flashover for a legacy room, and 3 minutes and 40 seconds for the modern room. This experiment, it confirms that there are differences, big differences, in regards to fire characteristics and fire growth versus legacy room versus a modern room. I'd also like to show you a video as well from the Home Fire Sprinkler Coalition of Canada. And this shows is basically the fire timeline of when a fire is called to 911 without sprinklers and with sprinklers. Fire begins. So deadly heat and flame smoke builds. Within a couple of seconds, smoke alarm goes on. Without fire sprinklers, there's little or no escape. Flashover between 3 to 5 minutes. No one survives flashover. Then 5 to 8 minutes without sprinklers. Response time, fire truck shows up. And then ultimately at the 10-minute mark, at the best case scenario, fire hose with water is put on the fire. Then we move on to a situation with sprinklers. Smoke alarm goes on in seconds. Also the sprinkler goes on in seconds, which ultimately controls the heat, flames, and smoke. Fire sprinklers give you time to escape. With fire sprinklers, there's no flashover, and firefighters arrive at the scene, and ultimately firefighters confirm fire is extinguished, and fire sprinkler saves you. It's that simple. Now we're moving on to total structural incidents in Canada from 2005 and 2014. So we're at the statistical moment right now in regards to the number of structural fires pertaining to the specific type of building that you have. If you noticed, just by looking at the stats, ultimately, if you look, 126,773 fires occurred in a residential occupancy, which a residential occupancy, in most cases, is very similar to basically a vulnerable occupancy. But they're not the same, obviously. But ultimately, this is where most of the fires occur. 62% to be exact in Canada from 2005 to 2014, fires occurred in those occupancies. I'll also like to point out as well that these statistics were only given by 5 jurisdictions only. So it's given from Ontario, British Columbia, Manitoba, and the Canadian Armed Forces in Alberta. I'd also like to show you as well the fire-related deaths that occurred in Canada from 2005 to 2014. And again, as you can see, the relationship between vulnerable occupancies and other type of building occupancies, which majority obviously with vulnerable occupancies mainly is senior citizens. And the rates are based off of 1 million population. Over 100 deaths in 2018 in Ontario alone occurred. But if you see the stat here of 13.3% of the deaths, fire deaths that occur in Canada is with senior citizens from 2005 to 2014. I'd also like to point out as well, basically burn patients' healthcare costs. So obviously there is cost involved with fires. Always will be. There was a study done by Sunnybrook study, which was published by the American Burn Association. And here are some of the statistics in 17 years from the Provincial Burn Center from 1995 to 2012. What was determined was the average cost per person or per patient is about $85,000. The total burn center costs alone is $96,448,194. And then the total calculated cost in Canada as a whole with burn patients' healthcare cost is $3.6 billion. I'd also like to note as well that the approximate burn injuries per year in Canada is about 45,000 people. And out of that, requiring hospitalization is 2,000. Now, I would like to talk about the Ontario Regulation 150/13 amendment, which was amended in the 2015 Ontario Fire Code. This amendment, or this Regulation 150/13, was basically filed in May 9th, 2013. And that's where the 13 comes from. And the 150 is basically the number of regulations that was done in Ontario. So it's the 150th regulation in 2013. And it was also enforced in January 1st, 2014. The enforcement started. With that, within the Ontario Regulation 150/13, Ontario Fire Code Section 9.7, it affects the retirement homes regulated by the Retirement Homes Act, care occupancies, and also care and treatment occupancies except for hospitals. Some of the contents within Part 9 of the Ontario Fire Code that basically also includes Section 9.5, buildings up to and including 6 stories in building height with residential occupancies. Section 9.6, buildings higher than 6 stories in building height with residential occupancies. And also buildings with a care occupancy or retirement home. The Ontario Fire Code Part 9 retrofit, exemption from the retrofit were buildings that comply with certain additions of the Ontario Building Code. Hospitals, as mentioned earlier, do not fall under the retrofit legislation or amendment within the Ontario Fire Code. Now, renovations, additions, and change of use also does not comply with the Ontario Fire Code requirements for retrofit, which is more stringent So if you have an addition, a renovation, or a change of use, you are not allowed to use the retrofit legislation 150/13 amendment that's in the Ontario Fire Code. You are going to have to use the Ontario Building Code in that regard. Retrofit principles of life safety is as follows. The main thing and the main purpose of this retrofit legislation is for life safety. It's for containment, means of egress, fire alarm and detection, and of course suppression. All four of these items is necessary for a successful life safety system. Retrofits changes under Regulation 150/13, Ontario Fire Code Part 9. Revised Section 9.4, Healthcare Facilities. New Section 9.7 was produced for buildings with a care occupancy or retirement home. The newest section of Section 9.7 in the 2015 Ontario Fire Code is basically buildings or part of the building that is of a home or hospital regulated by Section 9.4. To continue, so Section 9.4, Healthcare Facility Sprinkler Protection. Sprinkler protection is required in long-term care homes and also homes of special care containing care or care and treatment occupancies. This does not apply to hospitals. So there's incorrect wording in 91311, which confuses the issue. Longer retrofit compliance dates are required for these types of occupancies. And the reason for that was to not double up on the 1990 retrofits that were already taking place. These facilities are like hospitals that already required increased life safety provisions in 1990. Also made sense to wait until these facilities required renovations and new construction of newer facilities. These government-owned facilities and also they would be required for these particulars to be sprinklered by 2025 versus 2019. So the compliance for the mandatory requirement of fire sprinklers in a long-term care home, homes of special care containing care or care and treatment occupancies is basically January 1st of 2025. Also, the retrofit Section 9.7 applies to buildings containing care occupancies and buildings containing retirement homes. Buildings up to 6 stories high must satisfy the technical requirements of Section 9.5. Buildings over 6 stories high, again, must satisfy the technical requirements as it's specified in Section 9.6. Now we're leading up to basically what is a retirement home. So a retirement home is basically a home that requires a license basically a license is required for business that has to meet the Retirement Homes Act and the retirement home definition. With that, the Retirement Homes Act definition is basically as follows. A retirement home regulated under the Retirement Homes Act 1010, regardless of whether it is a care occupancy or residential occupancy. The retirement home complex or part of the retirement complex is basically where people are occupying these facilities that are primarily people that are 65 years of old or older. Also occupied and intended to be occupied by at least 6 persons not related to the operator. And also the operator makes at least 2 different types of care services available. With those care services, it's basically any service basically provided by members of the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons provides while engaged in the practice of medicine. Nurses provides while engaged in practice of nursing. Pharmacist provides while engaged in the practice of pharmacy. The following care services can be as follows. So basically 2 of these care services. So it could be administration of drugs, assistance with bathing, assistance with dressing, provisions of a meal, assistance feeding, continuance of care, assistance with personal hygiene, assistance with ambulation, the provisions of dementia care program, and the provisions of skin wound care program. Now with that, if you do fall under a retirement home, as I mentioned, you have to apply for a license for that. And ultimately, all these facilities are listed on the public register with the following website. So basically www.rhra.ca/en/search-the-public-register/. With that website, you will find out if that retirement home, if it does qualify for a retirement home, you will find that home on that website. And if you do see that the retirement home is classified as a retirement home and they're not registered as such and they're not on the website, then ultimately that's a problem and needs to be addressed. Care occupancies. So we talked about retirement homes. Now we're talking about care occupancies. A care occupancy is basically which special care is provided by a facility directly through its staff or indirectly through another provider to residents of the facility. A, who require special care because of cognitive or physical limitations, and who, as a result of those limitations, will be incompatible of evacuating the occupancy if necessary without the assistance of another person. Long-term care homes, when I'm talking about long-term care homes, is basically a place where adults can live and receive help with most or all daily activities, access to 24-hour nursing and personal care. Basically, you can expect much more nursing and personal care here than you would typically receive in a retirement home or supportive housing. Now, a special care and care treatment occupancy, which is a healthcare facility, is basically an occupancy in which persons receive special care and treatment in a healthcare facility. And some examples of the healthcare facilities include public hospitals, private hospitals, nursing homes. Now we can talk about fire sprinkler systems. So fire sprinklers of existing care occupancies in retirement homes, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, had to be completed by January 1st, 2019, as per 9751-91312. There's approximately about 730 facilities in Ontario. We are aware that currently there are buildings that are still not in compliant as of with the January 1st, 2019 requirement. So there are still facilities out there that require fire sprinkler systems. The only way to fix this problem is to discuss these buildings with your authority having jurisdiction so this can be rectified. And also, too, to please contact any CASA member for any assistance in regards to your building. for fire sprinklers. Also, too, I'd like to also mention as well, there was an announcement that was made by the Ministry of Senior Affairs to provide $20 million in funding for sprinklers in small retirement homes with less than 49 beds, and that is located in a rural community, meaning a rural population of less than 100,000 or a population density of less than 100 people per square kilometer. Again, this timeline has since been expired. The application deadline was June 1st of 2018 for the fire sprinkler system retrofit program, which has passed. And also all these retrofits had to be completed by December 31st, 2018. If you wanted more information in regards to that announcement, you can look at www.ontario.ca/page/fire sprinkler-retrofit-program if you want more information on that. Okay, so now we're basically figuring out what type of fire sprinkler system do I need in my care or vulnerable occupancy. With that, I made a table for you to understand what NFPA standard to use. And basically it's off of how many stories you have and how many people that are sleeping, that are being provided for. So the number of stories is basically provided on the number of stories, which is up to and including 3 stories. And then you have up to and including 6 stories. And then you have greater than 6 stories. Then you also have your sleeping provided. So if you had up to and including 3 stories with sleeping provided for up to 4 persons, sprinklers are not required. Now that requirement is dependent upon the building having interconnected smoke alarms provided. Now if that building does not have interconnected smoke alarms provided, then you have to put sprinklers in as per NFPA 13D. So that's up to and including 3 stories with sleeping provided up to 4 persons. Now, if you have 5 to 10 persons up to and including 3 stories, it's NFPA 13D type of system. With that, though, however, is basically if you have over 10 people that sleeping is provided for, then you have to use the higher NFPA 13 standard, which basically would be 13R. Moving on. Now, if you have a building with the number of stories up to and including 6 stories, it's any number of persons with sleeping provided for, and it's a 13R system. So it's real simple. So up to and including 6 stories, any amount of people with sleeping provided for, it is a 13R type of system. Now, if you have a building that a vulnerable occupancy that the number of stories is greater than 6 stories, it's basically any amount of people with sleeping provided for can be in that facility. But the NFPA standard that you have to use is NFPA 13. I would also like to remind everyone as well, with a vulnerable occupancy, this is only pertaining to the retrofit legislation. Now, if you have any change of use, any additions or renovations on a vulnerable occupancy, you do not qualify for this protection. You will have to follow the Ontario Fire Code, which ultimately will tell you that you have to use NFPA 13 regardless of your vulnerable occupancy. So here are some fundamental differences with the water that's required for each one of these standards. So 13, 13R, 13D. So depending on the design method, the design area shall be the area that includes 4 adjacent sprinklers that produce the greatest hydraulic demand plus 100 GPM required hose stream, and also you have to have a water supply of at least 30-minute duration. So that's NFPA 13. Those are the NFPA 13 requirements. Now the next standard below would be NFPA 13R, which NFPA 13R water supply requirements will be as follows. You have to calculate a minimum amount of 4 sprinklers, and the designer must ensure that it's either the largest floor area or the largest demand. And that demand, those 4 sprinklers, it could be basically a demand of 4 sprinklers spaced 12 feet by 12 feet. Basically could be more demanding, but ultimately it may not be that as demanding as 2 20-foot by 20-foot type of sprinklers. So you got to look at that. So you got to look at the largest floor area and the largest demand. You may have multiple calcs in this aspect. Also with the NFPA 13R is you require the inside-outside dwelling unit considerations must also be carefully reviewed as well. And then ultimately look in section 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3. So that is an NFPA 13R type of system. Now moving on to NFPA 13D. So NFPA 13D type of system is basically a system where you have to calculate 2 of the most demanding heads, which it's basically the farthest or highest away from where the water is coming into your building. With that in mind as well, with NFPA 13D as far as the water supply requirements goes, it's either basically 7 minutes for a building that is 1 story in height, less than 2,000 square feet, would be a 7-minute water supply. If it's more than that, then it's at least 10 minutes. But the one thing that is different in the Ontario Fire Code that you got to pay attention to is section 97512, which requires a 20-minute water supply versus a 10-minute or 7-minute as it says in NFPA 13D. So please pay attention to that. So use the requirement of the Ontario Fire Code section 97512. And just a little tidbit of information as well. For everyone to understand, the building code will always trump the NFPA standard. I'll always say it, I'll say it again, the building code tells you when to do something, and the NFPA standard will tell you how to do something. Moving on. So I made a little chart that basically shows some of the differences between NFPA 13R versus NFPA 13D. So on the left side of the table here, you have basically the NFPA standard, the purpose of the standard, the water supply, the component listing requirements, pipe and fittings that can be used, underground piping, fire sprinklers, fire department connection, alarm detection. Now with NFPA 13R and 13D, these types of systems provide a sprinkler system that aids the detection and control of residential fires and thus provides improved protection against injury and life loss. That's mainly the purpose for 13R and 13D. With 13, NFPA 13, the main purpose of NFPA 13, it's not only for life, but it's also for property as well. So it protects the property and the life to obviously help the people get out of the building. So with that as well, we talked a little bit about the water supply requirements. So the water supply requirements for 13R is 30 minutes. It's the same for 13 as well. And as I mentioned in 13D, I won't say it again, it's ultimately the main requirement for the water supply for an NFPA 13D in a vulnerable occupancy using the retrofit legislation is 20 minutes as per the Ontario Fire Code, Article 9.7 or Section 9.7. Also, the component listing requirements are required for 13R and 13. It's required for all except for the hangers, the rod, and also the pipe is identified within the standard as well. And then 13D is basically required for all except for tanks, expansion tanks, fire pumps, which basically that's another thing I want to clear up as well. Pumps in NFPA 13D systems aren't considered fire pumps, and thus you do not have to follow NFPA 20, which is the installation standard for fire pumps. So ultimately with 13D systems, they are considered pumps, and ultimately they do not need to be tested as per NFPA 20. The only requirements is basically testing it, is just turning it on to make sure that it does turn on when you do put it on, and ultimately it's functioning. That's the main thing for 13D systems. Also, there's no requirements of listing for hangers, water flow detection devices, and also water flow valves shall not be required to be listed as well. And then the piping and fittings, again, common requirements for 13 and 13R. One of the things for 13D, the common requirements is for instance, for multi-purpose systems, it does permit half-inch pipe in certain type of network systems, such as PECs. And also the underground piping, that there's nothing within the scope of 13R to conform basically with the local plumbing code, same with 13D. Fire sprinklers that have to be used in these systems shall be residential or quick response, and for 13D type of systems, strictly residential. Also, fire department connection requirements. Fire department connection requirements is required for 13 systems. In most cases, most buildings, it's usually a 4 by 2.5 by 2.5 Siamese connection. It's different for NFPA 13R. With 13R, it depends. So there has to be at least one FDC shall be provided for buildings that are accessible by a fire department, that basically where it exceeds 186 meters square or are more than a single story. FDC shall be at least 1.5 inches type of FDC. Now for NFPA 13D type fire department connections, there is no requirement for a fire department connection for 13D type of systems. And then moving on to the alarm detection. Alarm detection is required in 13 and NFPA 13R. If the building alarm is installed, water flow alarms must be connected. And also for NFPA 13D, there's no requirements per NFPA 13D for smoke detectors are installed. Some more information on the table. Again, the design, we talked about that. For NFPA 13R, most hydraulically, most remote for 13, usually the highest or farthest away from the water supply, incoming water supply. And then for 13R, it's the most hydraulically remote compartment with a maximum of 4 sprinklers inside the dwelling unit. Outside dwelling unit, see the note 1. And also NFPA 13D, it's the most hydraulically remote compartment with the maximum of 2 sprinklers. And then the design, so basically the amount of water that needs to be produced is a 0.05 gallons per meter square foot, or the listing of the sprinkler for 13R and 13D. And for NFPA 13, it's a 0.10 GPM per square foot, or the listing of the sprinkler for 13. And when we're talking about that, when we're talking about 0.05 gallons per minute per square foot, it's basically the amount of water going from the sprinkler head to the floor. That's how much water per sprinkler needs to be that's required out of the sprinkler head minimum to flow from the sprinkler head to the floor. Also, the sprinkler emissions for 13R and 13D, attics, garages, closets. Again, see Note 1 for 13R, see Note 2 for 13D. And then sprinklers on balconies. Again, look at C Note 1 for 13R and C Note 2 for 13D. I'd like to thank everyone for paying attention today. Again, if you have any questions or information pertaining to vulnerable occupancies in Ontario, please don't hesitate to give me a call, give me an email. There's my information. I'm also on Twitter as well at Casa Jason. Again, thank you for participating, and please stay tuned for future presentations in the future on YouTube.